The repair shop wanted $100,000 just to diagnose the problem. 3 senior engineers had already walked away without answers. Consultants had flown in from across the country, armed with diagnostic laptops and decades of combined experience, and every single one of them had left shaking their heads. No one, not the avionics specialists, not the propulsion experts, not the team from the most expensive private aviation firm on the East Coast, could explain why the aircraft kept shutting down in the final moments before takeoff. As the billionaire CEO prepared to cancel a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a grease-covered single father quietly stepped forward from the edge of the tarmac. He wasn't an aerospace engineer. He wasn't even on the official payroll of the repair crews now crowding the hangar. The experts laughed out loud when he asked for 10 minutes alone with the jet. 10 minutes later, every engine roared back to life. And what he said next left the most powerful woman in the room completely speechless. Victoria Sterling had not become one of the most influential technology executives in the country by making room for doubt. She had built Strata Systems from a 2-person startup, operating out of a rented garage in Austin, into a publicly traded company with operations across 11 countries, and a market valuation that made financial analysts revise their projections every quarter. She was 52 years old, and she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't require volume. People in boardrooms noticed when she walked in, not because she demanded it, but because the room simply changed when she arrived. Her decisions had moved markets. Her acquisitions had reshaped entire sectors of the technology industry. She was not a woman who panicked. She was not a woman who lost her composure in front of subordinates. She was not a woman who allowed herself to be derailed by circumstances she hadn't anticipated, which made what happened on that Tuesday morning in September all the more disorienting, because Victoria Sterling had anticipated almost nothing of what was about to unfold. The flight was supposed to take 2 hours and 40 minutes, departing from a private terminal at a mid-sized regional airport in Tennessee, bound for a private airstrip just outside of Boston. On the other end of that flight sat the most important meeting of Victoria's professional year, perhaps of the last several years. The acquisition talks had been ongoing for nearly 8 months. And after countless rounds of negotiations, revised term sheets, and politically delicate conversations between legal teams, the parties had finally agreed to a face-to-face session that would determine whether the deal moved forward or collapsed entirely. The target company, a defense-adjacent data infrastructure firm with proprietary routing technology that Victoria had been pursuing quietly for nearly 2 years, was being courted by at least 2 other buyers. The founder, a notoriously private former military contractor named Gerald Hatch, had made it clear through intermediaries that he would only commit to a buyer he could sit across from and look in the eye. He had agreed to one final in-person meeting. Just one, and it was scheduled for 11 o'clock that morning. Victoria had arrived at the airport before 7, earlier than necessary, because she believed in margins. She believed in giving herself space between plan and execution. She had reviewed the briefing documents over coffee at the private terminal lounge, made 2 calls to her general counsel, and walked out to the tarmac at 7:55, a full 30 minutes before scheduled departure. The morning air was cool and still. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue. Everything looked exactly as it should. And then, nothing worked. The first indication that something was wrong came from the cockpit. The pilot, a 20-year veteran named Marcus Cole, who had been flying Victoria's aircraft for 6 of those years, ran his pre-flight systems check and found a fault code in the engine monitoring array that he hadn't seen before. He ran the check again. The code reappeared. He attempted to clear it manually. It reappeared again, and this time, it was accompanied by a second fault signal from a different sensor cluster. Marcus had logged thousands of hours in aircraft of this class. He knew the difference between a glitch and a warning. He shut the engines down and stepped off the plane with an expression that told Victoria everything she needed to know before he said a single word. "There's a problem," he said. "I can't clear the fault codes. And until I understand what's triggering them, I'm not lifting this aircraft off the ground." Marcus was not a dramatic man. He said it the way a doctor might say a biopsy had come back abnormal without hysteria, but with an unmistakable gravity. Victoria nodded once. "Get the maintenance team." The airport's ground maintenance crew responded within 12 minutes. They were competent, thorough professionals who handled routine servicing and minor technical issues for the private aircraft that regularly used the terminal. They were not, however, equipped for what they found, or rather, for what they couldn't find. The fault codes pointed to the engine management system, but the diagnostic software showed no corresponding mechanical failure. No sensor appeared to be malfunctioning, no component read as damaged or out of specification. Everything looked correct, and yet the system kept shutting the engines down. The crew lead, a heavy-set man named Boyd, with 20 years of maintenance experience, wiped his forehead with a rag, and looked at Victoria with the particular expression of a professional facing something that exceeded his tools. "This is above our pay grade," he said. "We're going to need to bring in a specialist." Victoria checked her watch. It was 8:42. The meeting was in a little over 2 hours, and Boston was 2 hours and 40 minutes away by air. The numbers weren't working. She pulled out her phone and began making calls. The aviation repair firm that the airport's operations manager recommended was called Meridian Aerospace Services, and their reputation in the private aviation sector was substantial. They operated out of a regional hub about 40 miles away and maintained a rapid response team, specifically for high-value clients experiencing unexpected aircraft issues. Within 90 minutes of Victoria's call, 3 of their engineers arrived in a company van carrying what amounted to a mobile diagnostics laboratory, specialized computers, proprietary software interfaces, and a collection of testing equipment that the maintenance crew watched being unloaded with visible relief. The lead engineer was a man named Dr. Raymond Fisk. He had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from Georgia Tech, 17 years of experience in avionics systems analysis, and a manner of conducting himself that made it immediately, unmistakably clear that he was the most qualified person at any gathering he chose to attend. He was not wrong about his qualifications. He was, however, the kind of man who wore his expertise like a garment intended to make other people feel underdressed. He walked to the aircraft, studied it for a moment with his arms folded, and then turned to the maintenance crew with an expression of patient condescension. "We'll take it from here," he said. It was not a collaborative statement. His team moved with precision and efficiency. They connected their diagnostic systems, ran a full avionics sweep, tested the engine control units individually, and methodically worked through a checklist that clearly reflected hundreds of similar cases resolved over years of practice. For 3 hours, they worked. Victoria watched from a distance, making and receiving calls, trying to salvage what remained of the morning schedule. Gerald Hatch's assistant had been contacted. The meeting had been tentatively postponed to the afternoon, contingent on Victoria's ability to reach Boston by 1 o'clock. It was now past noon, and Dr. Fisk's team was still working. At 12:20, Fisk approached Victoria with the measured stride of someone delivering important news. He had a tablet in his hand. He turned it toward her to show a dense grid of technical readings that meant nothing to her. "We've identified the system region responsible for the fault codes," he said. "Diagnosing the root cause and preparing a repair path is going to require a full teardown analysis. Given the complexity of what we're dealing with, we're looking at a minimum of several days." Victoria held her expression steady. "And the cost?" He didn't hesitate. $100,000 for the diagnostic phase. Repair costs would be assessed afterward, depending on what we find. For a long moment, Victoria said nothing. She looked at the aircraft. She looked at the tablet. She looked at the runway beyond the fence line, where a small commercial plane was completing its takeoff roll, climbing smoothly into the afternoon sky as though it had never been asked permission. "Is there any possibility," she said carefully, "that this takes less time?" Dr. Fisk clasped his hands in front of him. "Mrs. Sterling," he said. And the slight misuse of her title was either a mistake or a choice. "If my team cannot identify the source of this fault, I can tell you with complete confidence that no one in this region can. We have the most advanced mobile diagnostics platform in the private aviation sector. What we're dealing with here is genuinely complex. 100,000 for the diagnostic is actually quite reasonable given the scope." He said it with the finality of a man who had never had his expertise questioned and expected that pattern to continue. Victoria stared at him for another moment. Then she nodded, because she had no alternative that she could see, and turned back toward the terminal. Ethan Brooks had been working at this airport for 4 years, and in that time he had become, in most relevant respects, functionally invisible. This was not said unkindly. The airport maintenance facility occupied a long, low building at the far end of the grounds, separated from the private terminal by 2 taxiways and a stretch of chain-link fence. The crew that worked there handled the kind of work that kept airports functioning without anyone noticing: equipment servicing, ground vehicle repair, infrastructure maintenance, the dozens of small mechanical tasks that accumulated invisibly in the background of a functioning aviation facility. Ethan was one of 8 mechanics on the day crew. He was 39 years old, lean and quietly built, with hands that bore the permanent marks of someone who had worked with metal and oil for most of his adult life. He had light brown hair that he kept short and practical, and he almost never spoke unless he had something specific to say. His coworkers liked him, not in the way that people like someone who makes the workplace louder and more social, but in the steadier, more durable way that comes from finding someone reliably competent and consistently decent. He showed up on time. He did the work correctly. He didn't complain. He went home at the end of his shift to a 2-bedroom house on the east side of town, where his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, was waiting for him. And that was, in its essential architecture, the life he had built after everything else fell away. What almost no one at the airport knew, because Ethan had never mentioned it, and there was no obvious reason for anyone to ask, was that before this job, before the 2-bedroom house and the quiet routines and the grease-stained coveralls, Ethan Brooks had spent 11 years as an aviation systems technician with the United States Army. He had been assigned to an attack helicopter maintenance unit and had later cross-trained in fixed-wing aircraft avionics. He had served 2 overseas deployments and had been decorated for his technical work during a period when aircraft availability rates were critical to operational success. He had a gift. His commanding officers had used that word specifically in his evaluation reports for systems diagnosis. A particular quality of attention, the ability to perceive patterns in mechanical behavior that other trained technicians missed. To identify not just where a fault presented, but why it had originated, and what that implied about the broader condition of a system. He had left the Army not because his career was failing, but because his wife, Hannah, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma when their daughter was 4 years old. He had come home, believing she would recover, and she had not. She died 22 months after her diagnosis, and Ethan had spent the following year learning how to raise a child alone, while navigating a grief that didn't announce itself dramatically, but settled instead into a kind of permanent, load-bearing quiet. He had taken the airport job because the hours were predictable, the work was physical and honest, and it left him enough at the end of each day to be present for Lily. He had not looked for anything more than that. That was the man standing at the edge of the maintenance facility fence that Tuesday afternoon, watching the Meridian Aerospace team work on Victoria Sterling's aircraft from a distance of about 40 yards. He had noticed the commotion earlier in the morning and had, without making anything of it, continued paying attention in the way that a person with a trained eye pays attention to things that occur near their domain. He watched the maintenance crew. He watched the Meridian team arrive and set up. He observed the sequence of their diagnostic approach from a distance. And as the hours passed, he began to form an opinion about what he was seeing, or more precisely, about what he was not seeing anyone check. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden revelation. It was more like the steady accumulation of an impression that eventually reached the weight of certainty. The fault behavior the aircraft was exhibiting, the way the shutdown sequence initiated at a specific point in the engine start cycle, the pattern of which systems it affected, and in what order was consistent with a particular class of sensor conflict that Ethan had encountered exactly once before, during his 3rd year in the Army, when a Chinook helicopter had exhibited nearly identical symptoms, and 3 separate diagnostic teams had spent a week looking in all the wrong places before a warrant officer had pointed out what everyone else had been overlooking. Ethan stood at the fence for a long moment. He turned it over in his mind. He was not a man who acted on impulse, and he was not a man who liked inserting himself into situations. He thought about Lily, who would be finishing school in 3 hours. He thought about the time he'd gone to her 2nd-grade science fair. and watched her explain photosynthesis to a judge with a seriousness that had made him feel something he couldn't have named. He thought about the warrant officer who had once given him a chance to demonstrate something that no one else had seen. Then he set down his wrench, wiped his hands on his coveralls, and walked toward the private terminal. The response was about what he had expected. He approached the outer perimeter of the work area and spoke first to one of the Meridian junior technicians, who looked at his coveralls and his airport maintenance badge and told him, with professional but unmistakable dismissiveness, that the situation was being handled. Ethan said he thought he might know what the problem was. The junior tech looked at him with an expression that didn't try very hard to conceal what he thought of that claim, and said he would pass it along, with the tone of someone who had no intention of passing anything along. Dr. Fisk, however, was within earshot. He turned and studied Ethan with the particular assessment that certain kinds of confident men apply to people they've already categorized. "You work the ground crew?" Fisk said. "Maintenance facility," Ethan said. "What is it you think you've observed?" Fisk asked. The phrasing was careful and clinical, designed to make clear that observation was a lesser category than analysis. Ethan described, briefly, the pattern he'd noticed in the shutdown sequence. Fisk listened with the expression of a professor hearing a student attempt to replicate an argument they'd clearly only partially understood. When Ethan finished, Fisk said, "That's not what's happening here. The fault signature we're tracking is in the engine control unit software. What you're describing is a hardware fault pattern, and it doesn't match the diagnostic data. Have you checked the secondary manifold pressure sensor?" Ethan asked. Fisk blinked. Just once. But Ethan saw at the fractional pause of a man who hadn't, in fact, checked that specific component, and who was now recalculating whether he should have. "We've run a full avionics sweep," Fisk said. "What kind of aviation background do you have exactly?" One of the other Meridian engineers had turned to look. A couple of the airport maintenance staff who were standing nearby had also gone quiet, in the particular way people go quiet when they're watching something that might become interesting. "I was a systems tech in the Army," Ethan said. "Fixed wing and rotary. 11 years. Fisk absorbed this. "Private aviation systems are significantly more complex than military maintenance work," he said. "The architecture is quite different." It was not entirely wrong as a statement. It was delivered in a way that had very little to do with accuracy, and quite a lot to do with the assertion of hierarchy. Ethan did not argue. He had been in enough rooms, in enough situations, with enough people who used knowledge as a tool for exclusion rather than for solving problems, that he had learned this particular economy. The energy you spend trying to convince someone who has already decided is energy you're not spending on the actual problem. He looked past Fisk toward the aircraft. Then he looked at the woman standing about 30 feet away, the CEO. He understood for whom all of this was happening, who had been watching the exchange with an expression that Ethan couldn't entirely read. He addressed her directly. "I'm not trying to get in anybody's way," he said. "If I'm wrong, it costs 10 minutes. But I'd like to take a look at something." There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Dr. Fisk began to speak. Victoria raised one hand, a gesture so minimal and so complete that it stopped Fisk mid-syllable. "Give him 10 minutes, she said. Ethan walked to the aircraft without hurrying. He didn't ask for any of the diagnostic equipment that the Meridian team had spent the last several hours deploying. He didn't request access to their computers or their proprietary software interfaces. He climbed the boarding steps, paused for a moment at the cockpit threshold to exchange a brief word with Marcus, and then moved through the aircraft with the unhurried attention of someone who was not performing thoroughness but simply exercising it. He looked at the physical configuration of the engine monitoring panel. He opened a small access panel near the cockpit instrumentation array that was, on its face, unremarkable, a secondary systems housing that most diagnostic protocols treated as a pass-through rather than a point of interest. He studied what was inside for perhaps 90 seconds. His expression did not change. He did not exclaim or gesture or reach for a phone. He simply looked, and then he reached inside with 2 fingers and made the smallest possible physical adjustment, something that, to anyone watching from outside, would have looked like nothing at all. Then he stood up and walked back down to the tarmac. "There's a secondary manifold pressure sensor mounted in the environmental control junction Inside the forward avionics bay, he said to Marcus, to Fisk, to the small crowd that had gathered without fully acknowledging that it was gathering. It's physically intact. It's not showing a fault because it isn't faulty in the diagnostic sense. The sensor itself is functioning. But it shifted position. Probably thermal cycling over time, the mounting bracket had minor fatigue. When it shifted, the angle of its pressure reading changed by about 3 degrees. That's enough for the engine management system to interpret the pressure differential as a pre-failure condition. The system sees what it thinks is an anomalous pressure reading before engine load comes up, and it initiates a protective shutdown every time. Same point in the cycle. He stopped. Dr. Fisk was staring at him with an expression that was working very hard to maintain the architecture of professional skepticism, but was beginning to show stress fractures. That reading would appear in the avionics sweep, Fisk said. The sensor would show as operating within normal parameters, Ethan said. Because it is operating within normal parameters, the problem isn't the sensor's function, it's its position. A diagnostic sweep tests whether a sensor is working. It doesn't test whether the sensor is physically aligned to the component it's measuring. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences before it. One of the Meridian junior engineers turned to look at the aircraft with the specific expression of someone beginning to wonder whether they should have thought of this themselves. The airport maintenance crew had stopped pretending to do other things. Victoria had not moved from where she was standing, but her posture had shifted not visibly to most people, but shifted in the way that someone shifts when the ground beneath a long-held assumption has quietly changed. "Start it up?" Ethan said to Marcus. Marcus Cole had been flying aircraft for 20 years. He had encountered engine problems over the Pacific Ocean, had brought a small plane down safely in a Nebraska cornfield after a fuel system failure, and had once managed a hydraulic emergency over the Rockies, with a calm that had been the subject of several grateful post-flight conversations. He was not a man who rattled easily, but in the 40-plus hours since this aircraft had first refused to start, he had run his pre-flight checks dozens of times and watched his instruments throw errors with a reliability that had begun to feel, in some irrational way, personal. He sat in the cockpit now and ran the startup sequence. The engine management system initialized. The pressure readings came up across his display. He watched the fault codes, the same codes that had appeared every single time he had attempted this sequence for the past 2 days, not appear. The engines spun up through their cycle. They did not shut down. They reached operational parameters and held there, steady and strong. The sound of them deep and even, and completely, correctly normal. Marcus checked his instruments twice. He checked the engine status panel. He looked at the monitoring array. He keyed his radio. "All systems nominal," he said. "No fault codes. Engines are reading clean." The sound that rose from the small crowd on the tarmac was not a cheer, exactly. It was more like the collective exhale of people releasing a tension they hadn't realized they'd been holding for hours. One of the junior Meridian engineers actually laughed, a short, involuntary sound of genuine surprise. Another shook his head slowly, looking at the aircraft with an expression that mixed professional embarrassment with the particular admiration that surfaces when someone has done something elegant. Dr. Fisk stood very still. His tablet was in his hand, but he was no longer looking at it. His face had the quality of a man performing rapid internal calculations, attempting to reconcile something that had just been demonstrated in front of him with the self-concept he'd carried into the morning. He was not a dishonest man. He was a proud man, and pride and honesty were now in a quiet war on his face. Victoria Sterling had not moved. She stood in the same position she'd been in when Ethan walked to the aircraft, but something in her was profoundly different. She had watched a man solve in 10 minutes what a credentialed team with a $100,000 diagnostics toolkit had failed to solve in 3 hours. She had watched him do it without drama, without equipment, and without once raising his voice or appearing to need anyone's approval. She watched the engines run. She listened to the sound of them, clean and reliable and alive. Then she looked at Ethan Brooks, standing on the tarmac in his airport coveralls with his hands at his sides, and she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the moment she had overridden Dr. Fisk to give him his 10 minutes. "Who are you?" she said. The question hung in the air for a moment. Ethan looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who had long since stopped trying to appear as anything other than what he was. He told her his name. He told her where he worked. He said he'd spent 11 years as an Army aviation tech and had left when his wife got sick. He said it simply, without self-pity, and without the particular performance of modesty, that is, its own form of self-presentation. He said it the way someone states a series of facts that constitute their life, not proud, not ashamed, just accurate. Victoria listened. Around them, the Meridian team had begun the quiet process of packing their equipment with the efficient, wordless energy of professionals who prefer not to linger in the vicinity of their failures. The airport maintenance crew had dispersed. Marcus was still in the cockpit, running through confirmatory checks. The tarmac had emptied until it was essentially just the two of them, and the aircraft humming steadily between them. "Your wife," Victoria said. She left space in the words. "Cancer," Ethan said. "She passed about 6 years ago." There was nothing performative about the way he said it. It was simply the central fact of a chapter of his life that had reshaped everything that came after it. "Your daughter," Victoria said. She had caught the detail. "Lily," he said. "She's 9. You've been working here since you left the Army?" 4 years, he said. "The hours work for us." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She looked at the aircraft. She thought about Gerald Hatch, waiting in Boston, and about the months of negotiation that had brought everything to this single critical meeting, and about the fact that none of that would have been possible this afternoon, this second chance at the schedule, if it hadn't been for the man standing in front of her, who had asked for 10 minutes and been laughed at for the asking. She had seen many kinds of intelligence in her professional life. She had built a company by finding it in unexpected places, by trusting pattern recognition over credentials when the evidence warranted it. She had hired people who most of her board wouldn't have interviewed and watched them become essential. She understood something about the gap between capability and opportunity. She understood it intellectually, in the way that people who have crossed that gap successfully often do, as a concept, as a philosophy, as a thing she believed in. But standing on a tarmac in Tennessee, watching the solution to a $100,000 problem materialize in the hands of a man nobody would have put in the room, she understood it differently. She understood it the way you understand something when it's standing right in front of you, and the math is undeniable. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "I owe you considerably more than a thank you." Ethan said nothing. He had the quality of a man who was comfortable in silences that other people felt compelled to fill. "I'd like to offer you a position," Victoria said. "Senior Aviation Systems Analyst. My company runs its own aircraft fleet, 4 planes in regular rotation. We have contracts with 3 aviation leasing firms in addition to our internal operations. The role comes with a 6-figure salary, a full benefits package, and I'll have an office set up for you in Nashville by the end of the month." It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary offer. It would have more than tripled his current salary. It would have repositioned him, overnight, from a man doing invisible maintenance work at a regional airport to a named professional with an executive-tier role at one of the country's most prominent technology companies. It would have changed his daughter's life in ways that were entirely concrete: better schools, more resources, the kind of financial stability that creates options rather than just covering necessities. Victoria Sterling had made offers like this before. She had watched them transform people's trajectories. She had seen the moment of recognition cross someone's face when they understood that a door they had stopped expecting to open was suddenly standing wide. She expected, at a minimum, a pause. She expected, perhaps, the particular stillness of someone trying not to seem too eager. Ethan Brooks looked at her with a calm, clear expression, and he said, "No, thank you." The words landed with a quality that required a moment to process. Victoria had been told no by competitors, by rivals, by regulators, and by boards. She had not frequently been told no by a man in maintenance coveralls on a regional airport tarmac after she had just offered him a 6-figure salary. "No," she said, not challenging, simply repeating it, as a person does when they want to confirm they heard correctly. "It's a generous offer," Ethan said. I mean that. But no. Can I ask why? He thought for a moment. Not with the hesitation of someone who doesn't know what to say, but with the precision of someone choosing the right words for something they've thought about before. In other contexts, in the quiet of mornings before his daughter woke up, "Money's not what I'm missing," he said. "I have what I need. I have Lily. I have work that makes sense to me. What I don't have," he paused, "and what a lot of people I know don't have, is a way for the work they're capable of to ever be seen." Victoria was quiet. "There are people working jobs like mine," Ethan said. "Good mechanics, good engineers. People who can do things that the credentialed teams can't do. They know it, but the credentialing system says they're not qualified. So the doors that open for someone like Dr. Fisk never open for them. They fix the equipment on the planes that other people fly. They don't get asked what they think." There was something in his voice that was not bitterness. It was quieter than bitterness and more durable, the voice of someone who has lived inside a structural truth long enough to describe it without anger, simply as what it is. "So what do you want?" Victoria asked. It was not a dismissal. It was a real question, asked by someone who was now listening in a different register than she had been when she walked out to the tarmac that morning. Ethan told her. He wanted something for other people more than for himself. He described it plainly, the way he described mechanical systems in terms of function, in terms of what was needed and what was missing and what could be done about it. There were people, he said, working maintenance and mechanical jobs at airports, in industrial facilities, in transportation, infrastructure, people who had skills built through years of hands-on work, through military service, through the kind of learning that happens in the actual presence of real problems, rather than in academic programs. They were not credentialed in the ways that institutional hiring systems recognized. They had not gone to the right schools or earned the right certifications, but they were capable of things that the credentialing apparatus consistently failed to identify or develop. He had seen it throughout his career. He saw it every day. He had thought about it in the particular, unresolved way that you think about things you know to be true, but have no power to change on your own. What he wanted, what he was asking for, standing on this tarmac, in the unlikely context of having just fixed a billionaire's private jet, was a program, something real, with institutional backing and genuine stakes. A pathway that evaluated what people could actually do, not what their transcripts said. A training and certification track that gave people like the mechanics he worked alongside a means of demonstrating their competence to organizations that would otherwise never look at them twice. He was not asking for charity. He was not asking for lowered standards. He was asking for a different, more honest way of measuring the same thing, capability, that organizations like Victoria's claimed to want. He talked for perhaps 4 minutes. He was precise and specific. He had clearly thought about this long before this morning. In the way that a person thinks about something they've observed up close for years and have never had the platform to address. When he finished, the afternoon light had moved slightly, and the shadow of the hangar had stretched a few feet further across the tarmac. Victoria had not interrupted him once. She had the expression of someone who is not simply listening but actively reassessing the boundaries of a decision they thought they had already made. "You're asking me to build a hiring program," she said. "I'm asking you to think about whether one is possible," Ethan said. "I'm not asking you to do it because you owe me something from this morning. I'm asking because your company is large enough that if it worked, other companies might follow." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. The engines of the aircraft were still running, steady and clean. A sound that was now inextricably connected in her mind with this conversation, with this man, with this specific pocket of an afternoon that had arrived at her uninvited and turned out to contain something she hadn't gone looking for. "I'm going to be late for my meeting," she said. "I know," he said. "Go." She did not go immediately. She stood there for another few seconds, looking at the aircraft, and then back at Ethan, as though wanting to confirm that what had happened this morning was real, and not some function of stress and schedule pressure, and the strange hours of a derailed day. Then she nodded. Once, in the way she had nodded when Marcus first told her there was a problem. A single, complete gesture of acknowledgement, and walked toward the boarding steps. The flight to Boston took 2 hours and 38 minutes. Victoria sat in the same seat she always occupied, with the same briefing documents she had reviewed that morning. But she read very little of them. She thought instead about the manifold pressure sensor, about the elegant simplicity of the solution that her $100,000 team had missed, about Dr. Fisk's expression in the moment the engines started, and about the man who had stood on the tarmac and described, in 4 unhurried minutes, a problem she had known existed at the level of principle, but had never held as clearly as she held it now. Gerald Hatch was waiting. The meeting was difficult and productive, in the specific way that important negotiations are, when both parties finally stop performing and begin problem-solving. Victoria was present, in a way she sometimes wasn't in rooms she'd been preparing for too long, alert, engaged, capable of the kind of precise listening that separates deals that close from deals that don't. They reached a letter of intent by early evening. She signed it in Hatch's conference room with the pen she kept in her jacket's interior pocket, the one her daughter had given her as a gift years ago, and felt the particular satisfaction of a conclusion that had required its full measure of difficulty to reach. On the flight back, she called her chief of operations, a methodical woman named Sandra Kwan, who had helped build Stratus's internal infrastructure from the ground up. Victoria described what she wanted. Not vaguely. Not as a concept to be explored. She described it with the specificity of a decision already made, the architecture of a program, its objectives, its evaluation criteria, its scope. Sandra asked questions. They were good questions. Victoria had answers for most of them. For the others, she said Ethan Brooks would have the answers, and she would like Sandra to arrange a meeting with him before the end of the week. The program that emerged over the following months was called Stratus Verified Skills. It was not, in its early form, a large or expensive initiative. It began as a pilot project embedded within the company's aviation operations division, focusing on the assessment and development of technically skilled workers who lacked formal credentials. The methodology was practical to the point of being almost elegantly simple. Candidates were evaluated on their ability to perform real diagnostic and maintenance tasks under conditions that simulated genuine operational problems. Not tests derived from textbooks, not written examinations. Actual systems, actual problems, actual performance, observed by assessors who had themselves been selected for their ability to evaluate competence rather than pedigree. The early results were striking. In the first cohort of 42 participants, 27 were offered formal roles or development tracks with Stratus or its contractor partners. Several of them came from backgrounds that no standard hiring process would have surfaced: retired military technicians, career airport ground crew, a woman who had spent 15 years maintaining agricultural equipment and had a systems intuition that the assessment team described, in their internal report, as exceptional. The program drew attention, not immediately, and not in the loud way that things draw attention when someone chooses to make noise about them. It drew the quieter, more durable attention of people in adjacent industries who noticed that Stratus's aviation maintenance costs had declined, that its aircraft availability metrics had improved, and that its operations team was doing something different in its talent pipeline that seemed to be producing better outcomes than the standard credentialing approach. 3 aviation-adjacent firms reached out to Sandra Kwan's team within 18 months, asking about the methodology. An industry publication ran a piece about the program that was careful and specific and was read, according to Sandra's tracking, by a significant number of human resources professionals in the transportation and logistics sectors. Victoria gave one interview about it, to a journalist she trusted, and said what she had said to herself on the flight back from Boston, that the most accurate measure of capability she had ever encountered was the demonstration of it. That credentials were often a proxy for capability. And proxies were useful until they became more important than the thing they were standing in for. That she had learned this lesson in a manner she had not expected, from a person no one would have put in the room. Ethan stayed at the airport for nearly 6 months after that Tuesday. He had agreed, in a series of practical conversations with Sandra Kwan, to serve as a technical advisor to the program's development, consulting on assessment methodology, reviewing candidate evaluations, and providing the kind of ground-level insight into what skilled technical work actually looked like that the program needed in order not to become what it was explicitly designed to avoid. Another institutional system measuring people against its own image. He did this work in the evenings and on weekends. In the same way, he did most things consistently, without announcement, with a focus on the substance over the recognition of the substance. When the program was far enough along that it needed dedicated leadership, Victoria offered him the role formally, with the same salary she had offered on the tarmac, adjusted for the months that had passed. This time, he said yes. The timing made sense. Lily was settled in school. The work was real. It would let him do something he believed in with the skills he had spent 20 years developing, and it would let him be home for dinner. The office Stratus set up for him was in Nashville, as Victoria had promised, on the 4th floor of a building with large windows that looked out over the city's north side. It was a modest office for his title, which suited him. He kept it clean and functional. On the desk, he put a framed photograph of Lily and one small object that most visitors wouldn't have identified: a mounting bracket, salvaged from the repair, the kind of small mechanical component that holds something in precise alignment and, when it fails just slightly, causes systems vastly larger than itself to stop functioning entirely. Months after the program's formal launch, Victoria flew into Nashville for a quarterly operations review. The aircraft she traveled in was the same one that had sat grounded on that Tennessee tarmac, maintained now by a crew that included 2 graduates of the Stratus Verified Skills Program, whose evaluations Ethan had personally reviewed. The departure was at 6 in the morning, and the sky above the airport was the color of cooling embers as the sun approached the horizon, deep orange fading to a pale gold at the edges, the kind of sky that only lasts for a few minutes before the day fully arrives and overwrites it. Victoria was in her seat, reviewing briefing documents as she always did, when she looked out the window during the taxi and saw, on the tarmac below, a figure in coveralls moving between ground vehicles with the same unhurried, self-contained energy she had first observed across a chain-link fence more than a year before. It wasn't Ethan. Ethan was in his office, preparing for the morning's meeting. It was someone else, a member of the ground crew, doing the invisible work that kept the airport functioning without anyone acknowledging that it was happening. She watched him for a moment. She thought about the manifold pressure sensor. She thought about the way a small misalignment in one component, too minor to trigger a formal fault code, undetectable by standard diagnostic protocols, could bring an entire system to a halt. She thought about what that implied, not just about aircraft, but about institutions, about organizations, about the way that systems designed to find capability could develop small, incremental misalignments over time, until they were measuring something other than what they intended, throwing false readings, shutting down the very things they were designed to support. The aircraft lifted off. The runway fell away. The city spread out below and then began to shrink. And the sky brightened around them as they climbed, and Victoria looked down at the grid of roads and buildings and runways until they dissolved into abstraction at altitude. She thought about the specific precision required to build something that doesn't just work in principle, but actually works, that holds its alignment under load, under variation, under the long accumulating stress of ordinary time. She thought about Ethan Brooks, who had understood something that her $100,000 team had missed, not because he was smarter than they were in every dimension, but because he was looking at the right thing in the right way with the right quality of attention, and because he happened to have been in the room. She thought about all the problems that still didn't have solutions, because the people who understood them best were standing on the other side of a chain-link fence, watching from a distance, waiting for someone to say 10 minutes was worth the risk. The aircraft leveled at cruising altitude. The sky outside the window was fully bright now, clear and open in all directions. Somewhere below, in a city of several 100,000 people going about the ordinary architecture of a Tuesday, a man was walking his daughter to school and then going to an office where the work he did was, for the first time in a long time, proportional to what he was capable of. He wasn't thinking about what had changed. He was thinking about the first meeting of the day, about a candidate evaluation that needed his attention, about whether Lily had remembered to take her lunch. He was thinking the way he always thought, specifically, practically, focused on the immediate substance of the thing in front of him. That was the quality, Victoria had come to understand, that separated people who actually solved problems from people who were very good at appearing to. Not the credential, not the title, not the conference room, the quality of attention you brought to the thing that was actually there, the willingness to look at what everyone else had already looked past and ask a different question. The patience to stay with it until the system told you what it needed to tell you, if you were listening in the right way. There is a particular kind of intelligence that institutions are not built to recognize. It does not announce itself. It does not come with documentation. It presents in the form of someone standing at the edge of a situation and seeing, with uncanny clarity, the thing that everyone else has been methodically looking past. It is not rare. What is rare is the combination of circumstances that allows it to be seen. A CEO who was desperate enough to override her own instincts about hierarchy, a man who was principled enough to ask for what he actually believed in rather than what he was offered, and a single Tuesday morning in September, when a misaligned sensor and a 2-hour flight window conspired to put the right two people in the same place at the same time. Stratus verified skills would eventually expand beyond aviation. Within 3 years of its founding, the program had established evaluation tracks in logistics, infrastructure, maintenance, and industrial systems operations. It had assessed more than 400 candidates. It had placed nearly 300 of them in roles that their credentials alone would never have opened. Some of them had gone on to lead teams. Some had gone on to train others. Some had simply done the work they had always been capable of doing, in environments that finally had a way to understand what they were worth. Ethan traveled to company sites twice a year to oversee evaluations in person, because he believed and had argued successfully that any system designed to assess practical capability had to be administered by people who respected practical capability, or it would slowly revert to measuring something else. He was right about that, as he tended to be right about the functional properties of systems. He did not enjoy the travel particularly, but he never complained about it, because the work was real, and the results were real. And he had learned long ago that real things required your actual presence. Each of those outcomes traced its origin back to the same quiet transaction, a man walking across a tarmac and asking for 10 minutes, and a woman deciding, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate in the moment, that 10 minutes was worth giving. The aircraft flew north through cloudless air, carrying its passenger and its history and its clean-running engines, and the ground below continued its work without ceremony or acknowledgement, which is the way that most essential things proceed. Quietly, correctly, and entirely without applause. The most important person in any room is not always the one who brought the credentials. Sometimes it is the one who was willing to look at the thing nobody else stopped to actually look at. Sometimes it is the one standing at the edge, in the coveralls, waiting for someone to say the 10 minutes was worth the risk.